Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com. Excited about today starting our coverage of the 2016 World Chess Championships between Magnus Carlsen, the reigning champion, 25-year-old, been the champion since 2013, and the challenger, Sergey Karjakin, 26-year-old. He won the 2016 Candidates tournament, so they are fighting for the World Championship. Tournament is from November 11th through November 28th. They essentially are going to be playing 2 days, take a day off, play 2 days, take a day off. We will have coverage as soon as the match is over. I will be starting the video, and then as soon as I'm done, I'll upload that. So keep an eye for the next few weeks to make sure that you are keeping up with all of the coverage. But if you're not too familiar with how the World Championship is going to go down, it's a little bit different than some of the other tournaments. For time controls, they have 100 minutes for the first 40 moves, and they get a 30-second increment added on after each move. Also, they cannot agree to a tie for the first 30 moves. So in some other tournaments, you may see after even 17 moves, they kind of look and say, let's not play this out. They're not going to be doing that in the World Championship. Now, if there's a threefold repetition where you have the same board state after 3 moves, in that particular case, that would be a drawn game, but they can't just extend their hand to their opponent unless it's after 30 moves. That should be exciting. We should be playing more towards victories in this tournament, less playing for draws. So that's always good. If you're not too familiar with kind of the history that these two players have, they've played 21 times before. Magnus Carlsen has won 4 of those times. Sergey Karjakin has won 1 of those, and they have drawn 16 times. So that's kind of the intro. Magnus Carlsen, from the opening ceremony, drew, and he drew white for the first game. So he's going to be going first in games 1, 3, 5, 8, 10, and 12. So there are 12 games. We're essentially playing till someone gets 6.5 points. So it could end before that if someone goes on a tear and starts winning. But that's kind of how it's set up. So Sergey Karjakin will kind of do every other, but then he does have white in games 6 and 7. So that's kind of the intro, just so everyone is aware of how the tournament's set up. It is being played in New York City in the United States. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started with game number 1. Magnus Carlsen decides to start with pawn to d4, something I was not expecting to see. Magnus Carlsen typically plays a little bit more aggressive style with pawn to e4, but pawn to d5, maybe a little bit slower for his taste. You know, we saw this a lot from Vishy Anand playing pawn to d4, but really expected Magnus Carlsen E4, he's been preparing for this tournament for many, many months. So maybe he saw something particularly in this opening. Sergey plays knight to f6, and then bishop to g5. So right away, Magnus Carlsen, the Trompowsky opening, was not expecting this. Really kind of thought pawn to c4, getting into the Queen's Gambit decline line, which Sergey Karjakin plays quite a bit. But Magnus Carlsen had something up his sleeve. Bishop here to f5, pawn to d5, very common way to respond. Pawn to e3, pawn to c5, attacking on the queen side, and then the bishop takes here on f6. And so typically in the Trompowsky opening, there's kind of this give and take. White's says, I'll go ahead and give up my double bishop pawn. Instead, I'm going to give you a double pawn structure, and you can keep a double bishop on your side. And towards the end of the game, I think my pawn structure's going to win out. And so black has a few options here. In the particular game, Sergey decides to go ahead and recapture with his pawn, capturing towards the center of the board. I think this is interesting. I would have taken a little bit differently. More times than not, I think it's easier and maybe even more correct to take pawn takes here on f6. I didn't see a lot of the commentary as I was watching it myself. They kind of glossed over and maybe said, you know, G pawn takes here on f6 is totally fine, but I think this is just easier to play in general. It does give a kingside safety if you want to castle on the king side. You open up the door for both your bishops, light square and dark square. You're protecting this pawn here on c5. If there ever is a capture, maybe pawn takes here on c5, you can easily get this involved into the board. You can castle on the king side. Very, very strong defense right here. And you also have this semi-open file if your queen wants to attack, or if you castle on the king side, your rook comes over here to e8. I really, really like this attack. Or defense, if you will, from black. But in the game, Sergey takes with his pawn here on f6, and then the pawn takes on c5. response from black is knight takes on c6, and he has a few options. Doesn't have to play knight on c6, but both sides up until this point, each move is taking about 5 to 7 seconds. They're not really thinking too much, so it looks like they've both prepared for this, even though this is kind of the last book move. There's not a lot of theory beyond this point. Both sides seem pretty comfortable in this opening. Now, I think it makes sense even to play, say, pawn to e6, just solidifying this pawn chain, opening up the door for this dark square bishop to attack right here. White has a few options. He could try to hold on to it, probably kind of a futile way to play. Pawn to b4, but then you can just start chipping away. Pawn to a5, maybe pawn to c3, take, and then pawn to b6. If the pawn takes, you're going to see the bishop can come down, take, check. The queen's eventually going to take this pawn here on b6. Going to be very hard for white to really hold down his material. And then all of a sudden you see black really controlling the queen side of the board. So instead he could have tried something else. Instead of pawn to b4, could have tried maybe more aggressive approach of queen to h5, and then the bishop takes on c5. I think this would have been pretty exciting. Both sides of the board have a pretty strong attack going on right now, but we didn't see this. In the game, we see knight to c6, which makes a lot of sense, and then the first time where a player actually started thinking. So, as we said, 5 to 7 seconds a move, and then Sergey Karjakin took 20 minutes for this next move. Or after bishop to b5, we see pawn to e6. And this took Sergey Karjakin quite a bit of time. He had a few options here, and maybe he was expecting, instead of bishop to b5, he was expecting knight to c3, and then maybe respond pawn to e6. Could have brought his queen, h5, f5 here, castle on the queen side. I really like this from Magnus Carlsen. Castling on the queen side and just throw the entire kitchen sink over here on the king side. Recognizing his opponent's probably not going to castle on the queen side, just because it's fairly open. And the king side is really his only other option, unless he wants to keep his king in the center of the board, but he can really have a strong attack here on the king side. Magnus Carlsen, though, decided not to want to do that at all. Played bishop here to b5. Played it pretty fast, and then after 20 minutes, Sergey Karjakin played pawn to e6. He could have tried something else. Could have tried, let's say, queen to a5, check. Knight to c3, a6. Bishop back here, a4, and then maybe pawn to e6. But says, okay, I don't want to get my queen involved into the game, so I'm just going to go and play e6 right away. So pawn to c4, after the pawn takes on c4, knight to d2. Magnus Carlsen does not want to trade off queens this early in the game. He's playing white. It's the first game in the World Chess Championship. He is the champion. There's no reason for him to kind of immediately go to a drawish game, which is exactly what would happen if he traded off queens right now. So he wants to keep that slim advantage that he has as playing the white pieces right now, and decides to go and play knight to d2. Sergey plays bishop takes on c5, just getting that material, and then knight to f3. So Magnus Carlsen is down a pawn of material, but it's going to be easy for him whenever he wants to go ahead and get this material back here on c4. He does have his bishop, does have his knight both attacking it. So it's kind of there for the taking when he wants to. Castle on the king side, castle on the king side. So black does have the double bishop pair that we talked about, but he just doesn't have as much king side safety as Magnus Carlsen does. So if Magnus Carlsen can start to form an attack on the king side, could be a little interesting how Karjakin wants to defend that. Knight to a5, trying to hold on to this material as long as possible on c4. Rook over here to c1, attacking that material. Bishop back here to e7. Queen to c2, putting more pressure on this pawn on c4. Bishop to d7. Bishop decides to go ahead and take here. Queen takes, and then queen up here to c3, attacking the knight that's no longer being protected by the queen. Another option he has, I like rook over here to d1, centralizing your rooks, and you do have a discovered attack. As soon as this knight moves up the board, let's say taking here on c4, he has a discovered attack against the queen. Just a really nice way to control the center of the board, getting your rooks involved, but decides to play queen here to c3, attacking this knight here on a5. Queen down here, d5, just putting more defenders on the square here on c4. Knight decides to go ahead and take here. There's no way to really hold on to it. Magnus Carlsen says, you know, I don't want to fight for it too much longer. After the queen's take, then the rook comes up here to c4. Now, this is a pretty draw situation. We're only 17 moves into the game, and they can't draw in this particular case. But if you look at both sides, neither of them has a really strong attack or really a path to get there. The rooks aren't going to be able to do even too much over here with an exposed king here on the g-file. If anything, I'd say Sergey Karjakin has the better minor piece. The bishop is able to control. If there's two pawn chains, you have one over here on the king side, or on the queen side, one over here on the king side. That's probably a little bit better than Magnus Carlsen's knight, which usually does better with pawn structures just on one side of the board. But it's fairly easy for Magnus Carlsen to even get rid of one of the pawn chains and to get his knight pretty active on the board, especially since there's two knights on there. So right now it looks pretty drawish, but hey, you never know, especially with Magnus Carlsen. He usually likes to extend games out really, really long. Even if he's not playing for this particular game, he likes to wear down his opponent. So later in a tournament, when they get a little bit tired, that's kind of where he thrives. So we'll kind of see how this continues. Rook over here to c8. Rook to c1, we start to see some exchange, so both sides seem like they're okay with just getting material off the board. Rook over here to d8, threatening a back rank mate with rook to d1. Have the knight come down here to e1, but then after the capture, this will be game over. So Magnus Carlsen rightly plays pawn to d3, making sure we don't have any of that. Rook to d7. Just defending the 7th rank for white. Magnus Carlsen would really like his rook to come up here to c7 and start to attack. Would have been attacking the bishop here, this pawn here. So Sergey Karjakin says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop that right now. Play rook here to d7. Magnus continues with the king to f1, starting to get his king involved into the game. Pawn to f5, king e2, bishop here to f5, attacking the pawn. Pawn up here to b3, making sure that his pawns are no longer able to be attacked on the queen side. King here to f8, pawn h3, pawn h6. Both sides just starting to push up a little bit on the board. Neither has a really strong attack going. King to e7, Sergey getting his king involved into the action. Knight here to d3, king d8, pawn up here to f4, pawn h5, pawn a4, rook down here to d5, and then Magnus Carlsen is just going to try his knight, just move it around as much as possible, see if he can find a weakness from Karjakin. Pawn to b6, forcing the knight to move. Knight here to a6, bishop up here to e7, knight b8, king or pawn to a5, knight back here c6, king e8, knight to e5. Neither side making much room as far as any sort of gain. It's still pretty drawish on board. Bishop down to c5. Very, very nice outpost for this bishop. Really stops any sort of threat of the rook getting past enemy lines and starting to attack. And now you can't have any sort of trickery with pawn to b4 just because you have all of these defenders with the pawn and the bishop right here. So the queen side's pretty much locked down. King side, it is also going to be fairly difficult for white to really break through. But we continue. Magnus Carlsen, a rook to c3. King e7, a rook over here to d3. And we see an exchange on board. So right now we're just getting pieces off the board. We're 36 moves in, so they can draw if they wanted to. Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and play on. Pawn to f6, the knight moves, check. And we see the knight come back here. King just continues to move forward a little bit. King c6, knight d4, king d6, knight b5, check. And then we see a little song and dance, and then all of a sudden they decide after 42 moves to go ahead and draw. So I was expecting maybe Magnus Carlsen to come out a little bit more aggressive in the first game. He's had so much preparation coming into this. I thought, yes, he did go outside of theory. I just expected that outside of theory to be something different than the Trompowski, which I just don't see him play that often. I thought maybe he'd be a little bit more aggressive against his opponent. But Sergey Karjakin, hats off to him in the very first game against the world champion to defend with the black pieces, get that draw. Going into tomorrow, you have the white pieces looking for the win there. So all in all, really excited about this tournament. I think it's going to be extremely, extremely good. We have two young players 25 and 26 years old. Magnus Carlsen actually turns 26 on November 30th. So if there is a tiebreaker, he will be playing for the championship on his 26th birthday. But I think both these guys can play 12 games and never really get tired since they are so young. So it should be really exciting. Hopefully you guys are excited about the World Chess Championship as well. Make sure you stay tuned every day for coverage as well. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.